Welcome to the Unlocking Victorian Justice podcast series about the 30th anniversary of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody. We hope that VALS Justice Yarns will help you learn about the Royal Commission and the urgent work that we must do to end Aboriginal deaths in custody. Please follow our social media, which is linked in the description underneath this recording. And if you'd like to support the work that VALS does, please donate at vals.org.au/donate. That's vals.org.au/DONATE. Hello and welcome to VAL's first ever podcast. I acknowledge and respect the Wurundjeri people as the traditional custodians of the land that the VALS Present Office is located on and where I'm recording this podcast from today. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and future, and Aboriginal elders of other communities who are involved with and work with VALS, and more broadly, all of those Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who fight every day to achieve justice for their people across Australia. Wherever you are listening to this in Australia, you are on unceded land. Sovereignty has never been ceded, and it was and always will be Aboriginal land. Just a warning for listeners, we will be discussing Aboriginal deaths in custody today, and some of the detail will be distressing or maybe distressing. And we encourage Victorian Mob to call VAR's Yarning Safe and Strong hotline on 1800 959 563 if you need to speak to someone. And Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people should be aware that this podcast may include the names of deceased persons. I'm Andrea Lux, Head of Policy, Communications and Strategy at VALS. Our team has expanded as a result of the hardening community support VALS received last year during the Black Lives Matter protests. We are grateful to you all. Addressing past and current injustices will require all of us to work together. We're doing policy and advocacy work that supports the main objectives of the Black Lives Matter movement in Australia, and we hope that we can share that work with a broad audience through platforms such as this podcast. A key part of our work centres around Aboriginal deaths in custody and the unfinished work of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody. Preventing and accountability for deaths in custody is a central goal for VALS. Since the beginning of March 2021, 5 Aboriginal people have died in custody across 3 states, including Victoria. And at the time of recording, thousands of Australians are preparing to attend rallies across the country, calling for governments to take action to end deaths in custody. Today, it is a very great honour to have Senator Patrick Dodson as our guest on our first ever podcast. Senator Dodson is a Yawuru man from Broome in Western Australia. He has dedicated his life work to being an advocate for constructive relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples based on mutual respect, understanding and dialogue. He is the recipient of the Sydney International Peace Prize as well. He has extensive experience in Aboriginal Affairs, including serving as the inaugural chair of the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation. Since 2016, he has been a senator representing Western Australia in the Australian Parliament. And of course, he worked as a commissioner on the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, which published its final report on the 15th of April, 1991, 30 years ago. Welcome, Senator Dodson, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to share this time with you at the anniversary of the Royal Commission. I think it's important to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people from my perspective, and the leaders of the legal service who over a long period of time have provided very valuable services throughout the state. My brother Mick, you did work at the legal service there at some early period. And I also want to acknowledge the families of the loved ones who've died in custody in the past, but certainly more recently since the Royal Commission report has come down. I acknowledge all those families and I express my sincere condolences to them.
Thank you for joining us again today, Senator Dodson. And I think what you've just pointed out is really important as well, that the advocacy of the families of those who have died in custody, and also the fact that although we often talk about how many people have died in custody since the Royal Commission handed down its report. Of course, hundreds, thousands of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have died since 1788. I might start with a brief introduction of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody for those of you joining us today who might not be across its history. In 1987, the National Committee to Defend Black Rights took their campaign to the United Nations, and this incentivized the government to take action. The Royal Commission was established in October 1987 in response to a growing public concern that deaths in custody of Aboriginal people were too common and public explanations were too evasive to discount the possibility that foul play was a factor in many of them. James Henry Moorhead was initially appointed as sole commissioner to investigate Aboriginal deaths in custody between 1st of January 1980 and 31st of May 1989. When the number of Aboriginal deaths in custody turned out to be more than double what was initially anticipated, 5 more commissioners were appointed, including Patrick Dodson, who's here with us today. And Senator Dodson was the only Aboriginal commissioner appointed. The Royal Commission held public hearings and community meetings to investigate 99 deaths in custody. Senator Dodson, I was wondering if you could reflect on the campaign that led to the establishment of the Royal Commission, and particularly the legacy of the activists involved and how governments responded to, and the public, how they both responded to the campaign.
Well, I saw the campaign as totally responsible in many ways for the government being moved eventually to call the Royal Commission into the circumstances around which people were dying in custody. There'd been obviously a growing momentum across the nation, so it wasn't just in one jurisdiction, across the nation of people, Aboriginal people who were taken into custody, and in some cases only being there for a short space of time and dying. And so that led many people to believe that there may have been foul play or misappropriate use of force, or that the police were in fact seen as probably doing things that were beyond their legal responsibilities. So there was a lot of concern about that. And I think the death in New South Wales of a young fellow out at Yawuru really was the last straw, where Bob Hawke decided that he would then call the Royal Commission, which was not only the death in custody, but the town, primarily of Aboriginal people, erupted, and there was huge protests and street activities, and people were very, very angry and frustrated. So I think the lack of information about what happened when people died, the slowness of that information being provided to the public, and the suspicion, given the role that police have played historically as, you know, so-called protectors, removing of Aboriginal kids to homes and to institutions. They're really the agency of the government to expand the government's appropriation of Aboriginal people's lands, but also to place Aboriginal people under constant surveillance in many of these places. So the police had this terrible reputation of being an agency, an unsympathetic agency of the government when it came to the dealings with Aboriginal people. And I think this culminated, and the focus around this culminated with these deaths and the publicity and the work of the activists who were obviously concerned as to why these deaths were occurring and were not getting clear explanations. And that just led to greater anxieties in the community until government actually was forced to act.
The Royal Commission made 339 recommendations. It's very extensive and a piece of work that many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have hoped would be fully implemented. The Royal Commission found that a major reason for Aboriginal deaths in custody is the grossly disproportionate rates at which Aboriginal people are taken into custody, of the order of more than 20 times the rate of non-Aboriginal people. Importantly, it said something can be done. to reduce this rate by law reform and changes in policing strategies. However, the commissioners did not find that the deaths were the product of deliberate violence or brutality by police or prison officers. They found that there appeared to be little appreciation of and less dedication to the duty of care owed by custodial authorities and their officers to persons in custody. Recently, we've seen a lot of campaigns by the families of Aboriginal people who have died in custody, focusing very squarely on the fact that police and prison guards have not been convicted of crimes in any of the more than 470 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander deaths in custody since the Royal Commission. 30 years later, what are your reflections on the Royal Commission's finding that no police or prison guards were responsible for deaths in custody? And do you think criminal responsibility for those who fail in their duty of care to people in custody is an important factor to ending these tragedies?
I think it obviously saddens me when the tragedy, and some of the tragedies we've seen in recent days of Miss Dew in Western Australia, and Mr. Walker in Western Australia, who was basically fried in the back of a van in the middle of the, travelling through the desert, and that there's very little repercussions for the persons who had them in custody at the time. It's a real conundrum, and the Commission also had to deal with this in terms of the notion of the responsibilities that someone had, like a police officer, a prison officer, or people in the medical spaces, their notion of obligation to those in custody was terrible. At the time, they were very neglectful themselves of complying with their own standing orders, and the standing orders obviously needed to be reformed. They were very neglectful of understanding anything about Aboriginal people, and certainly about their health dispositions, and that seems to be continuing today, because the numbers of people who are dying from the lack of immediate and constant immediate and appropriate medical care seems to be part of the reasons for why people are dying, and the stereotypical views that still pervade, where people were deemed to be just drunks or drug addicts or making up stories when in fact they had serious medical issues like epilepsy or diabetes, or were prone to comas and all sorts of things, and may have even had closed head injuries, which we saw with John Pat in Broome and in other cases. So there hasn't been sufficient addressing of the education of the police officers around these matters, and there needs to be attention, I think, and a revisit, not only to the standing orders, but to making sure that their officers are educated to those responsibilities, and then if they're not complying with those, then some stricter action certainly needs to be taken, not just a mark against their capacity to be promoted, but this has got to go to criminal culpability at the end of the day, and it's a question then of serious, harm that's being caused by their neglect when they should have been behaving in a far different manner.
Senator Dodson, when you were working on the Royal Commission 30 years ago and the final report was published, what was your hope for that report?
Well, as you know, my task in the Royal Commission was to look at the underlying issues, the legal, cultural and social factors that gave rise to why people were being taken into custody in the first instance. And I was primarily limited to Western Australia, although I participated in the final report in determining the recommendations, as did all commissioners. So my focus was looking at why are people becoming, why are we becoming, coming to the attention of police in the first case? And that led to understanding housing, health, education, unemployment, racism, bigotry, etc. And so the way I conducted my commission was a bit different than rerunning of a coronial inquiry as to who was responsible for what on the occasion that someone died. And that arose, of course, when Mr. Justice Muirhead retired, and there was a desire to replace him, and the Western Australian Premier Peter Dowding at the time and the police union were opposed to another commissioner that would just look at the criminal system as opposed to the broader social circumstances. And it was the police union to some extent that were keen to see someone look at these broader issues. Why are people coming into custody in the first place, and why are they dying? So the combination of the legal criminal justice system, the judiciary, the behaviours of officers and their duties and their responsibilities and their accountabilities to their standing orders, and the lack of real effective public policy by governments. And you've got to recall that ATSIC, the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Commission, which was a national commission with regional entities, was in existence at the time, and they were seen as an integral player in the supervision of the implementation of these recommendations, and that they would be able to bring to the attention of governments very quickly where governments weren't responding to the intent of the recommendations or the quality required that those recommendations pointed to. So there was a very different circumstance in one sense. We don't have a voice to Parliament, and I know people are agitating for that. But at the time, there was a lot of hopefulness that with ATSIC's role, a voice to the Parliament, a national voice, regional entities, focusing in on public policy issues, health, housing, education, employment, etc., and looking at reforms within the judicial and legal criminal justice system, that we would have a better future for First Nations peoples and a better level of collaboration between the not only the legal services and the agencies of government, but also of governments themselves, that the national leadership of the federal government would help to coalesce, I suppose, the reluctance of states to shift and change in the way that they should behave when they've got people under their care in custody. So that national leadership is lacking today, and I think it's drifted away very substantially by this current federal government that has constantly pushed these things back to say that the state's responsible for these things, and they're pretty much washing their hands of it. So their leadership in this space is an indictment in itself, and a contribution, in my view, to the growing and the awful numbers that we've seen of people dying in custody since the Royal Commission's made its recommendations.
Thank you, Senator. And you've touched on the implementation of the recommendations of that Royal Commission. The 339 recommendations of the Royal Commission were very practical, things like ensuring access to bail so people aren't locked up for charges such as shoplifting. For example, there's the current coronial inquest for Veronica Nelson in Victoria, and she passed, unfortunately, tragically, in the women's prison, Dame Phyllis Frost. It also included recommendations around the design of prison cells to reduce incidences of self-harm, recommendations around adequate provision of health and mental health services. So even though we have those recommendations and have had them for the last 30 years, no state or territory or federal government has ever implemented all those recommendations. Are you of the view that governments should still pursue implementing all of those recommendations? And even if they do implement the recommendations, is there still more work to be done beyond the Royal Commission?
Absolutely, and it appalls me that drunkenness was only recently removed as a crime in Victoria. And if you look at the 3 deaths that were inquired into during the Royal Commission period, those people were basically taken in for drunken being disorderly, and without any understanding of their health positions, and that's still happening in Victoria. The awful, the taking people into custody for drunkenness, for fine defaults. Those issues were clearly at the forefront of the Commission's recommendations at the time, and hanging points as well for cell designs. So to find that, people will find means to take their lives if they are determined to do so, but the removal of such obvious aspects that gives, make it easier for that was what the Commission was trying to get some relief about, saying, well, design these places so that it's harder for people to take their own lives if those, and provide better services, of course. So you had a visitor scheme that was meant to operate and help people. You had early notification schemes, like, people are in custody, notify the legal service so they can notify families, so that people could be visited by family members and helped through their traumas or crises, and help in the explanation of someone's background in terms of their medical background. So the whole optimism I think that I had was that we would see a better agreement basis between the Aboriginal organisation at the time, which was ATSIC and its regional entities, and the governments in how the public policies that affected Aboriginal people were going to work, and a greater level of say. I mean, 30 years on, we're now arguing for a voice to the Parliament that would do exactly that, when in fact we had that voice back at the time of the Royal Commission under ATSIC and the regional entities. And it's obvious that the advisory committees to governments, what's called the AJAC committees, the Aboriginal Justice Advisory Committees, were proposed to be set up not only to look at the legislative developments, but also the social developments, and to note the trends as to whether we're escalating incarceration rates or detention rates for young people, and whether there was any shifts, as we've seen with women, the level of women being incarcerated these days. So, and so that you could bring the relevant agencies together outside of a crisis point and focus in a constructive way on what needs to be done collectively, and where the responsibilities lie for the remedial actions that are being undertaken.
Linda Burney was in the media a few weeks ago asking for a national public database of Aboriginal deaths in custody. And I suppose this is a timely question, given that I'm not sure if you've seen, the Guardian database has updated its numbers and released that today, saying that at least 474 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have died since the Royal Commission. Do you support having a publicly available national database of Aboriginal deaths in custody? And if so, what would be the benefits in your view of having such a database set up?
Well, I think it appalled me a couple of weeks ago at Senate estimates to be told that fundamentally the government relies on newspaper reportings on what's happening in this space. There should obviously be a national entity that has responsibility for notifying as soon as practicable once someone dies in custody and the families have been contacted, but making that clearly available and known to the public, and as much of the circumstances as to why that person died also being made, so that we diffuse the concerns as best you can before people draw the worst conclusions that take place. And obviously an update on how effective the implementation has taken place. We know this government has relied upon a report that's been seriously criticised by over 30 academics in this space, and because of its overly positive notion of how they've implemented the recommendations. And there should be a clear analysis now going forward on how these recommendations are being implemented and where they are falling short. And we should capitalise now on the best remedial actions like justice reinvestment schemes and the courts, the Koori Court and other courts that are in existence, and where community-led solutions are being proposed, and support those things. So the notion of an entity that monitors the deaths in custody would not only just give us a tabloid, as it were, on numbers, but would deal with a range of these factors and bring it to the attention of the relevant governments in order to get redress. And if people read the circumstances of many, and particularly the Victorian deaths in custody at the time of the Royal Commission, they'll find that the coronial inquiries were very inept in looking at how the police behave, what did they do, or looking at what could be done to improve the circumstances. So coronial inquiries should provide some direction on how to rectify some of these things, but a monitoring entity would tell us clearly what needs to be done at a macro level or a major level in order to get better collaboration between the states and the Commonwealth, and of course, better dialogue between the agencies, the judiciary, policing services and custodial services, so that we're not looking at a situation of conflict and adversarial debate, but we're looking at how to deal with why people are coming into custody at the rates at which they are, and trying to find ways to keep them out of custody as best we can.
I absolutely agree. I think there's a lack of transparency around the status of the implementation of the recommendations, the number of people who have died in custody, and the circumstances under which they have died. So since the Royal Commission handed down its report 30 years ago, there have been both Labor and Liberal governments at both state and territory level and federal level. What do you see as the main obstacle or obstacles to progressing implementation of the recommendations?
It's political will, ultimately. It's the will of the federal government to show leadership, and that'll be true if where Labor's been the federal government and hasn't shown the leadership. But this is a national problem. It's a national indictment upon our nation that this is occurring when we've had a very, constructive Royal Commission 30 years ago with 339 recommendations. The analysis of those recommendations being implemented and the effectiveness of that implementation and any of the positive things that have arisen since that ought to be taken account of and promoted by the governments in collaboration with either the NATSLs, the legal services, or through the peak organisations, or through some other arrangement until there's a voice to the Parliament. But obviously this setting goals that are way out is not the solution at the moment. It's the redress that has to happen on a daily basis, on a regular basis, between those with responsibility and the Aboriginal agencies.
When we're talking about political will, that leads nicely into our next question, which is, since the last federal election, the Black Lives Matter movement has gained momentum and broad support across Australia. Do you think Australians' votes will be influenced by the party's commitment or lack thereof to ending Aboriginal deaths in custody?
I think it will have. I think Black Lives Matter is a bit, it's focused a bit more on the entrenched racist attitudes that underpin the behaviours of people who are not well equipped at a cross-cultural interface, and it deals with the symbolisms of the supremacy of one group against another group and the lack of balance in that space. So this goes to the truth-telling exercise that was called for from Uluru and goes to the agreement-making processes. But there has to be, and there will be, an impact from Black Lives Matter, because it's a bit of a reaction to the colonial thrust of using police to destabilise Aboriginal populations by physically removing kids who are of mixed race, and then of subjugating people in very many locations, and then policing people under very draconian laws like drunkenness and other matters now, where the police are still seen as the agency of the colonial expansion and settlement and the embedment of a illegal sovereign position by a lot of First Nations people. So without getting too complicated into the politics, I think the Black Lives Matter program campaign has got a number of components to it. It's not just about what happens between police and Aboriginal people or people of colour. It's about the historical redress that needs to happen about the relationship and the symbolism about that underpins those narratives of that relationship. And that takes us into another space altogether, I think.
I might give you an opportunity if there's anything in particular you'd like to talk to before we wrap up.
Look, I would just encourage the work of the legal services. I know they're totally under-resourced on many fronts. They are a critical advocacy point. I work with many good lawyers over my time in Central Australia who came from the Victorian Bar primarily, but there are many other good lawyers from other jurisdictions. The time for advocacy is now, and we can't be timid about it. And when you had a silk turning up at the Court of Petty Sessions at Yawuru, starting to challenge the decisions of a magistrate, then change started to happen. So we've got to get senior legal practitioners back into this space, talking about reforms, not just to the criminal justice system. We then need the activists to focus also on the social policy practices. The cashless debit card, I mean, what a dead-end policy that is, you know? And so we've got to deal with social policy as well as criminal justice in the main, and don't lose focus of those two things. And I just sign off by, again, restating my condolences to all those loved ones who are grieving for those who've lost.
Thank you again, Senator Dodson, for taking the time to be on our first ever web podcast. It's been really an honour to have your insight into this crisis, especially in light of the anniversary coming up next week. This is really something that implementing the Royal Commission recommendations, that's something that the governments should have done many decades ago and could have prevented Aboriginal deaths in custody and not left families and communities grieving. We so often talk about the numbers, but behind every single number, it's a person and a family and a community impacted by that for the rest of their lives and down through the generations as well. So thank you once again for all of the work that you've done across the span of your entire career in terms of trying to end this crisis and Aboriginal deaths in custody.
Thank you.
Dear listener, if you're still with us, thank you for listening. Please check out our other podcasts in the Royal Commission anniversary series, VALS Justice Yarns. And a reminder to follow us on social media and donate to VALS if you want to support our work. The links are below in the description. And of course, wherever you're listening to this podcast from, across this land, sovereignty was never ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land.